The judge's face hardened as she stared at the medal on his chest. "Remove that decoration immediately. This is a court of law." But when she discovered what that cross really meant, the entire room fell silent, then rose to their feet in respect. So what exactly did she learn? Before we reveal that moment, press the subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Wellington Barracks like grey gauze, casting long shadows across the preparation room floor. It was early, and the familiar sounds of military routine filled the air. Soft brush of cloth against brass, the gentle scrape of boot polish being worked into leather, the quiet murmur of men who'd shared these mornings for years. Colour Sergeant Daniel Harrow sat near the far window, methodically working a cloth over each button of his scarlet tunic. At 34, he carried himself with a kind of stillness that came not from ceremony but from something deeper, something earned in places where stillness meant survival. The envelope had arrived the night before, cream-colored paper, formal script, his name typed across the front with military precision, Colour Sergeant D. Harrow, Coldstream Guards. Inside, a court summons, Westminster Magistrates Court, a case involving disruption of ceremonial protocol. He'd read it once, folded it neatly and set it beside his polishing kit without comment. Now, as dawn crept across the barracks yard, Corporal Jenkins glanced over from his own preparation. "Bit unusual, isn't it? Court appearance in full dress." Harrow didn't look up from his buttons. "Orders are orders." Still, Jenkins persisted, lowering his voice. "Seems odd. They'd want the Victoria Cross on display for a civil case." That made Harrow pause. His hand stilled for just a moment over the small bronze cross pinned below his left collarbone, the medal that had changed everything and nothing all at once. Most days he forgot it was there. Other days, it felt heavier than the rifle on his back. "Protocol states, full dress," he replied simply. "Everything earned." The truth was more complicated. 3 weeks earlier, during a ceremonial procession down the mall, a young protester that had broken through the barriers. Not violently, not dangerously, just a 20-something activist with a megaphone and strong opinions about military spending. The police had handled it professionally. The crowd had barely noticed. But somehow, the incident had escalated into formal complaints, legal proceedings, and now this, a courtroom appearance that felt more like theater than justice. What the paperwork didn't mention was the protesters' social media campaign afterward. Videos had been posted edited cleverly to show only the arrest, not the context. About military intimidation, claims of excessive force, the kind of viral outrage that burned bright and fast, leaving real consequences in its wake. Harrow had watched it all unfold from the same quiet distance he maintained toward most civilian controversies. He'd served in places where real threats came without cameras or comment sections. This felt different, smaller, but orders were orders. And if the court wanted him in full dress, he'd comply. By morning, he was standing before the mirror in the equipment room, making final adjustments to his uniform. Every crisp knife sharp, every piece of brass, mirror, bright. The bearskin hat added 18 inches to his already considerable height, but it was the Victoria Cross that drew the eye. Bronze, forged from Russian cannons captured at Crimea, suspended from a crimson ribbon that had faded slightly with age. He'd earned it in Helmand Province, though he rarely thought about the specifics anymore. Some memories were better left undisturbed. What mattered was that 23 men had come home because of what happened that day. 23 families who didn't have to receive folded flags and empty condolences. The cross wasn't a decoration to him. It was a responsibility. "Transports here," called the adjutant from the corridor. Harrow nodded to his reflection, shouldered his ceremonial rifle with practiced precision, and walked toward whatever waited at Westminster Magistrates Court. Rain had stopped by the time his car pulled up to the courthouse, but the London sky remained the color of old pewter. Westminster Magistrates Court was one of those buildings that had witnessed decades of small dramas, minor infractions, civil disputes, the kind of cases that mattered enormously to the people involved, but rarely made headlines. Today felt different. A small crowd had gathered outside, some holding signs, others just curious onlookers who'd heard about the military intimidation case on social media. Cameras flashed as Harrow stepped from the vehicle, but he paid them no attention. He'd learned long ago that the best response to chaos was stillness. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with the particular energy of a building full of people waiting for other people to make decisions about their lives. Solicitors in dark suits shuffled between courtrooms, clerks pushed trolleys of files down narrow corridors, and in the public galleries, small dramas played out in whispered conversations and nervous glances. Courtroom 3 was already nearly full when Harrow arrived. Journalists occupied the back rows, phones ready despite the no-recording rules. Legal observers filled the middle section, and scattered throughout were the usual collection of activists, curious citizens, and court regulars who attended hearings like other people watched daytime television. He entered through the side door reserved for official personnel, following the bailiff's quiet directions to a position at the rear of the room. No fanfare, no announcement, just the soft click of his boots on polished floor, and the subtle shift in atmosphere that accompanied his presence. The scarlet tunic caught the overhead lights like a beacon. Every piece of brass gleamed with parade ground perfection. The bearskin hat added an almost medieval silhouette to his already imposing frame. But it was the Victoria Cross that drew the stares, that small bronze medal that somehow commanded more attention than all the ceremonies surrounding it. A young solicitor nudged her client, whispering urgently, "That medal, is that actually real?" An elderly gentleman in the third row leaned toward his grandson. "That's a Victoria Cross, lad. Highest award for bravery. Only a handful of living men wear one." The murmur spread quickly through the gallery, each whispered explanation adding weight to the moment. By the time the clerk called for order, every eye in the room had found its way to the figure in red, standing motionless at the back. Then the double doors opened, and Judge Margaret Thornton entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd presided over thousands of cases and had little patience for dramatics. She was known in legal circles for her sharp mind and sharper tongue, a woman who'd climbed to the bench through merit and maintained her position through competence. She settled into her chair, adjusted her robes, and opened the day's docket with practiced efficiency. But as her eyes swept the courtroom in that ritual scan all judges perform, they caught on something unexpected. The scarlet uniform, the ceremonial rifle, the medals. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, addressing the defendant, "you stand accused of." She paused, her gaze drawn back to Harrow. The words seemed to catch in her throat. As she focused on the Victoria Cross, the silence stretched uncomfortably. The clerk shuffled papers nervously. The defendant's solicitor looked around in confusion. Finally, Judge Thornton found her voice again, but it carried a new edge. "Why is a war medal being displayed in my courtroom?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and unavoidable. Harrow didn't respond immediately. He wasn't required to, but the judge's tone made it clear she expected an answer. The clerk leaned forward, consulting his notes with obvious discomfort. "Your Honor, Colour Sergeant Harrow was detailed to attend in ceremonial capacity. The court summons specified full-dress uniform." Judge Thornton's frown deepened. "I didn't ask about uniforms. I asked about that medal." She pointed with her pen toward Harrow's chest. "This is a court of law, not a parade ground. Remove the decoration." The words fell into absolute stillness, not silent stillness, the kind that comes when something fundamental shifts in the room's understanding of itself shifted. Harrow didn't move, didn't speak, just maintained that perfect military bearing that had been drilled into him through years of service, and refined by moments when movement meant death. "Judge." Thornton's voice rose slightly, carrying the authority of bench and robe. "Sergeant, I will not have my courtroom turned into theater. Remove that medal immediately." From the corner of the room, a figure stood, an older man in Royal Army uniform, liaison ribbons marking him as someone accustomed to navigating between military and civilian authority. "Ma'am," Major Richardson said respectfully, "that is a Victoria Cross. Protocol dictates it remains with the wearer in any official capacity." The judge didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Harrow. "I don't care if it's the crown jewels. This is my courtroom, and I decide what's appropriate here." An elderly man in the gallery whispered to his companion, "That's the highest decoration for valor, only handed out for actions in the face of the enemy." The whisper carried farther than intended, rippling through the seats like water finding its level. Judge Thornton's patience, never abundant, began to fray visibly. "I'll have no psychological displays in here. No symbols meant to intimidate or influence. That medal creates an atmosphere inconsistent with impartial justice." G.T. leaned forward, voice carrying steel. "Either it goes, or you do." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Every person in the courtroom understood they were witnessing something rare, the collision of two systems of honor, each absolute in its own sphere. Then Harrow spoke, not loudly, not defensively, but with the calm precision of a man who'd chosen his words carefully. "Permission to remain as instructed, Your Honor." Orders were to appear in full dress, medals included. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't challenge, it was the voice of duty meeting duty, military protocol encountering judicial authority with quiet respect, but unwavering commitment. Judge Thornton studied him for a long moment. Something in his stillness, his refusal to be rattled or provoked, gave her a pause. She'd dealt with grandstanding and showboating before, but this felt different. Heavier. She glanced at the liaison officer, then at the clerk, then back to Harrow. "Very well," she said finally. "Let the record show the court's objection to the display. We'll proceed, but I will not have this room turned into spectacle." She tapped her gavel once, sharp, decisive. "Call the first witness." The case resumed it, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. The defendant, a 22-year-old protester named Lyle Granger, sat at the defense table, stealing glances over his shoulder at the figure in scarlet. Every time his eyes found a Victoria Cross, his expression grew more subdued. Granger's defense counsel, Ms. Sarah Turner, stood to present her opening argument. She was experienced, articulate, and normally confident, the kind of lawyer who thrived on challenging authority. But today, something in the room's atmosphere seemed to mute her usual fire. "Your Honor," she began, "my client stands accused of disturbing the peace during a lawful protest, but I submit that the real disturbance comes from the unnecessary militarization of civic space." She gestured toward Harrow without quite looking at him. "The presence of an armed guard in full military regalia including combat decoration, an atmosphere of intimidation that prejudices this court against any citizen expressing dissent." It was a reasonable argument, legally speaking. Courts were supposed to be neutral spaces, free from influences that might sway judgment, but as the words left her mouth, they seemed to lose force in the face of Harrow's quiet presence. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named James Crawford, rose to respond. "Your Honor, the guard is present at the court's own request following standard protocol for cases involving disruption of ceremonial duties. His decorations are part of his uniform, no different from the robes worn by counsel or the bench." Judge Thornton looked from one lawyer to the other, then back to Harrow. "Sergeant, step forward." For the first time since entering the courtroom, Harrow moved. 3 precise steps brought him to the space normally occupied by witnesses and barristers. His boots made no sound on the polished floor. "State your name and rank for the record." "Colour Sergeant Daniel Harrow, Coldstream Guards, British Army." "You were ordered to appear here today." "Yes, ma'am." "Detailed by regimental command." "To witness proceedings involving disruption of ceremonial protocol." Judge Thornton leaned back slightly. "Were you present during the incident in question?" "Yes, ma'am." "Part of the ceremonial escort detail." "And in your opinion, was the disruption significant enough to warrant legal action?" Harrow paused for just a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the careful consideration he gave to any question that might require him to judge civilian behavior. "The individual crossed security barriers and approached the procession without authorization," he said finally. "Police responded appropriately. No one was injured. It was a fair assessment, neither condemning nor excusing. The kind of measured response that came from someone who'd learned to see situations clearly without the distortion of emotion or agenda." Miss Turner saw an opening. "Sergeant, you carry that rifle and wear those medals as part of your ceremonial duties, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And would you agree that such displays might seem intimidating to civilian protesters?" The question hung in the air. It was carefully crafted, designed to make Harrow either admit his presence was meant to intimidate, or deny the obvious impact of military bearing on civilian sensibilities. Harrow considered it with the same quiet attention he'd given the judges. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I wear what I earned. The uniform represents service. The medals represent sacrifice. If someone finds that intimidating, perhaps they should ask themselves why." The response wasn't confrontational, but it carried a weight that seemed to settle over the courtroom like morning mist. Simple, direct, impossible to argue with. Judge Thornton frowned slightly. "Sergeant, that medal you wear," explained its significance. "The Victoria Cross is awarded for valor in the presence of the enemy, ma'am." "And when did you receive it?" "Those miły dezoito, ma'am." "For actions in Helmand Province." The room seemed to hold its breath. Afghanistan was still fresh in public memory, a conflict that had touched nearly every British family in some way, whether through service members or the constant stream of news about casualties and homecomings. Miss Turner, sensing the shift in atmosphere, pressed on. "And you believe wearing symbols of warfare in a civilian court serves justice?" Before Harrow could answer, a voice from the gallery interrupted. "If I may address the court." Everyone turned to see an older man rising from the third row. He was well-dressed, precise in bearing, and carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. His voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the courtroom. Judge Thornton hesitated. Interruptions from the gallery were highly irregular, but something in the man's demeanor made her pause. "State your name and business," she said, carefully. The man straightened to attention with military precision. "Colonel Robert Mallister, retired. I commanded Sergeant Harrow in Afghanistan." A murmur ran through the courtroom like electricity through water. This wasn't just a random observer. This was someone who'd been there, who knew the story behind the medal. Everyone was debating. "Colonel," Judge Thornton said slowly, "this is highly irregular. You're not a scheduled witness." "No, ma'am," Mallister replied. "But you've been discussing the appropriateness of that medal in your courtroom. Perhaps it's time someone explained what it represents." The judge found herself in uncharted territory. Every instinct told her to maintain order, to stick to procedure. But the weight of the moment, the presence of both men, the medal, the questions being raised seemed to demand something more than bureaucratic routine. She gave a slight nod. "You may speak briefly." Colonel Mallister didn't move from his position in the gallery. He didn't need to. His voice carried the kind of authority that came not from rank alone, but from having led men through the worst imaginable circumstances. "It was July 15th, 2018, he began. Temperature was 48 degrees Celsius. Our convoy had been ambushed. On the road between Lashkargah and Camp Bastion, the lead vehicle hit an IED. The rear was cut off by small arms fire, and we had wounded men pinned down in the killing ground between." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the journalists had stopped taking notes, caught up in the gravity of what they were hearing. No one ordered Sergeant Harrow to act, Mallister continued. He wasn't the senior man on the ground. He wasn't responsible for the situation, but when he saw Corporal Baines and Lieutenant Shee bleeding out in that ditch, he didn't wait for orders. The colonel's voice remained steady, but those who listened closely could hear the emotion underneath the weight of memory, of decisions made in moments when hesitation meant death. He ran across 40 meters of open ground under direct fire, once to provide covering smoke for the wounded, once to pull Corporal Baines to safety, and a third time to carry Lieutenant Shee, who outweighed him by 2 stone, to the casualty collection point. Someone in the gallery gasped softly. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness. When the enemy advanced on our position, Mallister said, his voice growing quieter but somehow more intense, Sergeant Harrow took up a defensive position and held the line for 43 minutes alone. We counted the brass afterward, Mallister said. 27 rounds fired. 27 hits. He didn't miss once. Harrow hadn't moved throughout the entire account. He stood at perfect attention, eyes forward, as if the colonel were describing someone else's actions entirely. When I recommended him for the Victoria Cross, Mallister continued, the review board asked me to justify why his actions rose to that level. I told them what I'm telling you now. That man ran toward gunfire 3 times to save soldiers who weren't even under his command. And when the situation turned desperate, he stood his ground against overwhelming odds so that 23 other men could go home to their families. The colonel paused, his gaze moving from the judge to Harrow and back again. If that medal makes you uncomfortable, Your Honor, it's because you haven't earned the right to judge it. That's not a criticism. It's simply a fact. Most of us haven't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of recognition, of the weight that comes when abstract concepts like honor and sacrifice become personal and real. Judge Thornton sat motionless for nearly a full minute. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, more thoughtful, stripped of the sharp authority she'd wielded earlier. Colonel Mallister, she said quietly, thank you for that clarification. She turned to Harrow, who still stood at attention, unmoved by either the praise or the attention. Sergeant Harrow, she said, you may remain as you are, full dress, full honors. There was no applause. The moment was too profound for such gestures. But a subtle shift ran through the courtroom, shoulders relaxing, expressions softening as if everyone present had just witnessed something rare and important. Miss Turner, the defense attorney, stood slowly. Your Honor, she said, her voice lacking its earlier combativeness. The defense withdraws its motion regarding the guard's presence. Judge Thornton noted, and accepted. She looked around the courtroom once more, her gaze lingering on Harrow and the small bronze cross that had started it all. The record showed that this court recognizes the distinction between military ceremony and military service. The former may be subject to civilian oversight. The latter is not. She picked up her gavel, hesitated for just a moment, then continued. The presence of Sergeant Harrow and his decorations serves as a reminder of why we have the privilege to sit in this room and debate matters of law and order. Some reminders are uncomfortable. That doesn't make them inappropriate. The proceedings resumed, but everything had changed. The defendant's case was heard with new gravity. The arguments weighed with an understanding of context that hadn't existed before. Lyle Granger, the young protester, pleaded guilty to a minor charge and received a conditional discharge, a fair outcome that satisfied both law and mercy. But the real verdict had already been delivered, not by judge or jury, but by the simple presence of a man who wore his medals, not as decorations, but as responsibilities. As the court prepared to adjourn, something unprecedented happened. It started with Colonel Mallister, who rose slowly from his seat in the gallery. Then Major Richardson, the liaison officer, stood at attention. One by one, others joined them, veterans, serving soldiers, even civilians who understood what they had witnessed. They didn't salute, they didn't cheer. They simply stood, in quiet recognition of something larger than the legal proceedings they'd come to observe. Judge Thornton watched it all with an expression that mixed surprise with something deeper, respect, perhaps, or understanding. When the last person had risen, she stood as well, adding her own acknowledgement to the moment. Harrow, still at his position near the witness stand, gave a single nod of appreciation. Then he turned with military precision and walked toward the exit, his bearing unchanged, his duty complete. As he reached the door, Judge Thornton's voice stopped him. Sergeant Harrow. He turned back, meeting her eyes with quiet attention. Thank you, she said simply, for your service, and for reminding this court what service actually means. He nodded once more, then stepped through the doorway and into the grey London morning. Outside, the rain had started again, a gentle mist that caught the light from the street lamps and turned the ordinary world soft around the edges. Harrow walked down the courthouse steps with the same measured pace he'd maintained inside, his uniform spotless despite the weather, his purpose clear despite the complexity of what had just occurred. A group of schoolchildren was passing by with their teacher, part of some educational outing to the courts. One of them, a boy of perhaps 10, tugged at his teacher's sleeve. Is that a real soldier? The teacher looked up at Harrow, at the scarlet tunic, the bearskin hat, the rifle, and the small bronze The defense withdraws its motion regarding the guard's presence. Judge Thornton nodded, and accepted. She looked around the courtroom once more, her gaze lingering on Harrow and the small bronze cross that had started it all. The records show that this court recognizes the distinction between military ceremony and military service. The former may be subject to civilian oversight, the latter is not. She picked up her gavel, hesitated for just a moment, then continued. The presence of Sergeant Harrow and his decorations serves as a reminder of why we have the privilege to sit in this room and debate matters of law and order. Some reminders are uncomfortable. That doesn't make them inappropriate. The proceedings resumed, but everything had changed. The defendant's case was heard with new gravity. The arguments weighed with an understanding of context that hadn't existed before. Lyle Granger, the young protester, pleaded guilty to a minor charge and received a conditional discharge, a fair outcome that satisfied both law and mercy. But the real verdict had already been delivered, not by judge or jury, but by the simple presence of a man who wore his medals not as decorations, but as responsibilities. As the court prepared to adjourn, something unprecedented happened. It started with Colonel Mallister, who rose slowly from his seat in the gallery. Then Major Richardson, the liaison officer, stood at attention. One by one, others joined them, veterans, serving soldiers, even civilians, who understood what they had witnessed. They didn't salute, they didn't cheer. They simply stood in quiet recognition of something larger than the legal proceedings they'd come to observe. Judge Thornton watched it all with an expression that mixed surprise with something deeper, respect, perhaps, or understanding. When the last person had risen, she stood as well, adding her own acknowledgement to the moment. Harrow, still at his position near the witness stand, gave a single nod of appreciation. Then he turned with military precision and walked toward the exit, his bearing unchanged, his duty complete. As he reached the door, Judge Thornton's voice stopped him. "Sergeant Harrow." He turned back, meeting her eyes with quiet attention. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your service, and for reminding this court what service actually means." He nodded once more, then stepped through the doorway and into the grey London morning. Outside, the rain had started again, a gentle mist that caught the light from the street lamps and turned the ordinary world soft around the edges. Harrow walked down the courthouse steps with the same measured pace he'd maintained inside, his uniform spotless despite the weather, his purpose clear despite the complexity of what had just occurred. A group of schoolchildren was passing by with their teacher, part of some educational outing to the courts. One of them, a boy of perhaps 10, tugged at his teacher's sleeve. "Miss, is that a real soldier?" The teacher looked up at Harrow, at the scarlet tunic, the bearskin hat, the rifle, and the small bronze